Eleanor Wright adjusted her wide-brimmed hat as she glanced out the window of her modest apartment. The sun cast golden light over the neighborhood she had called home for nearly 50 years. The streets bustled with life, children playing on the sidewalks, the aroma of fresh bread wafting from Mrs. Lopez's corner bakery, and neighbors exchanging greetings. For Eleanor, this wasn't just a place. It was a sanctuary filled with history and heart. At 74, Eleanor had seen her share of hardship, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. Her years as a schoolteacher had left her a beloved figure in the community, a mentor to countless children who now brought their own kids to meet Miss Eleanor. Her laughter was a soothing balm, her advice a steady anchor for those in need. That morning, Eleanor prepared for her daily walk to the corner market. She tied a lavender scarf snugly around her neck, its color a cheerful contrast to her neat gray coat. Just as she was about to leave, a knock on the door startled her. "Coming," she called, her voice warm and steady. When she opened the door, her nephew, Michael Carter, stood there, a bag of groceries in one hand and a radiant smile on his face. At 28, Michael was tall, sharp-minded, and fiercely driven, a reflection of Eleanor's own youthful ambition. "Aunt Eleanor," he greeted her, stepping inside. "I thought I'd save you the trip today." Eleanor chuckled, ushering him in. "You spoil me, Michael, but I was looking forward to stretching these old legs." Michael set the groceries on the kitchen counter. I know, but I can't let my favorite aunt overwork herself." Eleanor laughed, shaking her head. "You're sweet, but this community is what keeps me going. A little walk to the market lets me see everyone, and I like to know what's going on around here." Michael's expression turned serious. "That's exactly what worries me. I know you love this place, Aunt Eleanor, but it's not always as safe as you think." Eleanor paused, studying him with her wise brown eyes. She knew Michael had seen the world through a different lens, a harsher, more cynical one. His work as a community organizer brought him face to face with injustice daily, and his distrust of authority, especially the police, was well-earned. "Michael," she said gently, "I've lived here for decades. I know these streets like the back of my hand." Michael sighed, frustration flickering across his face. "You trust too easily, Aunt Eleanor. The world's changed, and not for the better. I just want you to be careful." Eleanor reached out and patted his hand. "I appreciate your concern, sweetheart, but fear doesn't solve anything. You know that better than anyone." Michael didn't argue further. Instead, he gave her a hug and a soft smile. "All right, Aunt Eleanor. Just promise me you'll call if you ever need help." "I promise," Eleanor said firmly. "Now, go on. You've done enough spoiling me for one day." As Michael left, Eleanor gathered her things and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The streets were alive with the hum of the community. Little Maya from the building next door ran up to her, her braids bouncing. "Miss Eleanor, can I help carry your bag today?" Eleanor smiled, taking Maya's hand. "Of course, dear. I'd love the company." They reached the crosswalk at the corner of 8th and Main. The traffic light turned green for pedestrians, and Eleanor stepped forward with measured, deliberate steps. Maya skipped alongside her, chattering about school. It was then that Eleanor heard the low growl of an approaching engine. A police car sped toward the intersection, its lights off. Eleanor glanced up, expecting it to slow as it approached the crosswalk. But it didn't. Her heart raced as she tightened her grip on Maya's hand. The car bore down on them, its roar growing louder. For a brief moment, Eleanor locked eyes with the driver, a young officer, his face unreadable. He was speaking into his radio, his hand on the wheel. "Wait, Miss Eleanor." Maya's voice was shrill with panic. Before Eleanor could react, the car struck her. Pain shot through her body as she crumpled to the pavement. The world spun around her in a cacophony of shouts, screams, and screeching brakes. As darkness enveloped her, Eleanor's last thought was of Michael's words, "The world's changed." The police car finally came to a stop. The driver, Officer Jacob Marshall, stepped out, his expression a mixture of annoyance and detachment. He glanced at Eleanor's motionless form without urgency, as if this were just another routine inconvenience. By then, a small crowd had gathered, their faces etched with shock and fury. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted. Maya knelt beside Eleanor, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's hurt. Somebody help her." From a nearby car, a woman filmed the entire scene on her phone, capturing Officer Marshall's indifferent demeanor and the raw emotion of the moment. News of the accident spread like wildfire through the tight-knit neighborhood. By nightfall, nearly everyone had heard about what had happened to Eleanor Wright. The beloved former schoolteacher, the heart of the community, had been struck by a police car in broad daylight. The shock of the incident was quickly replaced by anger, fear, and a desperate need for answers. Michael Carter sat in the hospital's waiting room, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. He had rushed over the moment he received the call. Now, hours later, he was still waiting for an update. The sterile white walls and hum of fluorescent lights did little to calm him. Finally, a nurse emerged, her face soft with sympathy. Michael stood immediately. "How is she?" he asked, his voice tight. "She's stable," the nurse replied, "but the injuries are severe. Broken ribs, a fractured leg, and a head injury. We're monitoring her closely." Michael exhaled shakily, the weight of her words pressing on him. "Can I see her?" The nurse hesitated. "She's unconscious, but you can sit with her for a few minutes." Michael followed her into the room, his chest tightening at the sight of Eleanor lying so still, her small frame nearly swallowed by the hospital bed. Machines beeped softly, tubes snaking around her like vines. He approached slowly, his throat constricting. "Aunt Eleanor," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The neighborhood outside the hospital was buzzing with conversation. Groups of residents gathered on street corners and in living rooms, venting their frustration. "Miss Eleanor? Of all people!" Mrs. Lopez exclaimed to her son as she wrapped bread for a late-night order. "She's the kindest soul in this whole neighborhood." "And the officer just kept driving?" her son asked, incredulous. "That's what people are saying." Barely even looked at her. For many, the incident felt personal. Eleanor had been a symbol of goodness in the community, always there with a helping hand or a kind word. Now, the thought that someone could treat her life with such callous disregard was unbearable. By the next morning, Michael was back in the neighborhood, pacing the sidewalk in front of Eleanor's apartment building. He had barely slept, his mind consumed by rage and helplessness. The sound of children playing nearby brought him back to reality. Maya, the little girl who had been with Eleanor at the time of the accident, sat on the steps with her knees drawn to her chest. Her braids were messy, and her face was streaked with dried tears. Michael crouched beside her. "Maya," he said gently, "are you okay?" The girl looked up at him, her lip trembling. "I didn't know what to do, Mr. Michael," she whispered. "I tried to help her, but—" Michael placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did everything you could. This isn't your fault." Her small voice cracked. Why didn't he stop? She was right there. We were right there. Michael swallowed hard, his own anger simmering beneath the surface. "I don't know, Maya, but we're going to find out. I promise." That evening, Michael called a meeting at the community center. Dozens of neighbors packed the small room, their faces tense with worry and indignation. "This can't keep happening," an older man said, slamming his fist on the table. "First they ignore us, then they endanger us. And now this?" Michael stood at the front, his hands gripping the edge of the podium. "What happened to my aunt is unacceptable," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "Officer Marshall didn't just hit her. He didn't care enough to stop, to check if she was okay. That's not an accident. That's negligence." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "We've all experienced it," Michael continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "The disrespect, the disregard. But this time, we have a chance to fight back. There's video evidence. Witnesses. They can't sweep this under the rug, not if we make enough noise." "What can we do?" asked a young woman in the back. Michael's voice grew stronger. "We organize. We demand accountability. We make sure the world knows that Eleanor Wright's life matters, and that this community won't stay silent any longer." The room erupted in applause, a wave of determination spreading through the crowd. Meanwhile, the police department issued a brief statement. The incident involving Officer Jacob Marshall is under investigation. We extend our thoughts to the victim and her family during this difficult time. The statement offered little comfort. Many in the neighborhood saw it for what it was, a half-hearted attempt to deflect criticism. Later that night, Michael sat alone in Eleanor's apartment, surrounded by the familiar items that defined her world. Family photos, neatly arranged books, and the scent of lavender from her favorite candles. He pulled out his laptop and began typing furiously, crafting a post for social media. My aunt, Eleanor Wright, was struck by a reckless police officer yesterday. She is a pillar of this community. Retired teacher, a mentor, a friend. Her life is worth more than a hollow apology. We demand accountability for the officer who hurt her and for the system that allows this negligence to continue. Please share her story. Let's make sure this doesn't get buried. By morning, the post had gone viral. Comments poured in from neighbors, activists, and strangers, all expressing outrage and solidarity. Michael's phone buzzed nonstop with messages from journalists and civil rights organizations offering support. It was clear, Eleanor's story had struck a nerve, and people were ready to take a stand. The morning after Michael's post went viral, his phone buzzed relentlessly. Notifications from social media, emails from journalists, and calls from concerned neighbors filled his screen. He hardly had time to breathe as he scrolled through the outpouring of support and outrage. This can't keep happening. We're with you, Michael. Prayers for Eleanor. She's a hero in our community. This officer needs to be held accountable. Enough is enough. But amidst the flood of support came the trolls and detractors. Accidents happen. Stop trying to ruin a cop's life over this. Typical. Always trying to play the victim. Michael's jaw tightened as he read those comments. How could anyone dismiss what happened to Eleanor as just another accident? He knew this wasn't just about one incident. It was about a system that devalued people like his aunt and others in their community. Later that day, Michael met with Grace Monroe, a civil rights attorney who had reached out to him after seeing his post. Grace was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, and no-nonsense. She had a reputation for taking on cases others were too afraid to touch. You've got a strong case here, Grace said, her voice firm as she laid a folder on the table in front of Michael. We have the video footage, eyewitness accounts, and Officer Marshall's abysmal record. That alone gives us leverage. Michael raised an eyebrow. Abysmal record? Grace nodded, flipping through the folder. Marshall has a history of reckless behavior. Multiple complaints filed against him over the past 5 years. Excessive force, racial profiling, and now this. But guess what? Michael leaned in, his fists clenched. Let me guess. Nothing ever happened? Exactly. Grace's expression hardened. Every complaint was either dismissed or buried. The department claimed there wasn't enough evidence, or they gave him a slap on the wrist. It's a pattern, one that shows how deep the rot goes in this system. Michael felt a surge of anger. So, what do? We hit them where it hurts, Grace said. We file a lawsuit against the department and Officer Marshall. We demand accountability, not just for Eleanor, but for every person who's been ignored or silenced. Michael hesitated. A lawsuit sounds good, but I need more than that. I need people to understand what this means, what she means to us. Grace leaned back in her chair, studying him. Then we make this bigger. The media's already paying attention. Use that to amplify your voice. Hold rallies, organize protests, and tell the stories the system wants to hide. Michael nodded, determination settling in his chest. Let's do it. As Grace worked on the legal front, Michael returned to the streets. He spent hours collecting stories from neighbors, people who had faced their own run-ins with Officer Marshall and others like him. One of the first people he spoke to was Mr. Bryant, a retired mechanic in his late 60s. He pulled me over last year, Mr. Bryant said, his hands trembling as he spoke. Claimed I fit the description of some car thief. I told him I was just coming home from work, but he didn't care. Made me stand outside in the cold while he tore through my car for no reason. Did you file a complaint? Michael asked. I did, Mr. Bryant replied bitterly, but nothing came of it. They said there wasn't enough evidence. Michael's notebook filled quickly with similar stories. A young mother harassed while walking her son to school. A teenager detained without cause because he looked suspicious. A shop owner accused of theft after confronting Officer Marshall about parking in front of her store. The pattern was undeniable. By the end of the week, Michael had organized a rally in front of the precinct. Hundreds of residents showed up, holding signs that read, "Justice for Eleanor. No more excuses. Our lives matter." Michael stood at the front, his voice amplified by a portable microphone. "We are here today because of Eleanor Wright," he began, his voice steady and resolute. "But this isn't just about her. This is about every single person in this community who has been ignored, disrespected, and dehumanized by a system that's supposed to protect us." Cheers and applause erupted from the crowd. "They tell us to trust them," Michael continued. "But how can we trust a system that allows someone like Jacob Marshall to remain on the force after years of complaints? How can we trust a system that treats Eleanor Wright, a retired schoolteacher, a pillar of this community, like she's expendable?" The crowd roared in agreement, their chants echoing through the streets. Inside the precinct, Officer Marshall watched the rally from a window, his jaw tight. His superior, Captain Reynolds, stood nearby, arms crossed. "This is getting out of hand," Reynolds muttered. "We need to issue another statement." Marshall scowled. "I followed protocol. The light was green when I approached the crosswalk. It's not my fault she stepped out." Reynolds shot him a hard look. "You'd better hope that holds up in court, because if this goes south, you're on your own." Back at the rally, Michael spotted a young woman standing near the edge of the crowd, holding her phone. She approached him after his speech. "Michael?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes?" "I was there when it happened," she said. "I was in my car, and I saw everything. I recorded it." Michael's heart raced. "You recorded the accident?" She nodded, pulling out her phone. "The whole thing." The light was red for the car, and he didn't even slow down. "And after he hit her," her voice cracked, "he just got out and looked at her like she was nothing." Michael took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he accepted her phone. "This is exactly what we need." "Thank you." The woman looked at him with tearful eyes. "Make sure they see it. Make sure they know what he did." Michael promised her he would. With the video in hand, Michael and Grace went to the media. The footage aired on local news that night, sparking an explosion of outrage. People across the city, and beyond, were now paying attention. "Eleanor Wright deserves justice," Michael said during a televised interview. "This video proves what we've been saying all along. This wasn't an accident. It was negligence. And it's part of a bigger problem we can't ignore anymore." The public pressure mounted, and by the end of the week, Officer Marshall was placed on administrative leave. But for Michael and his community, this was just the beginning. The video of Eleanor's accident spread like wildfire, igniting outrage not just in the neighborhood but across the city. The grainy footage showed Eleanor and Maya in the crosswalk, the pedestrian light green. Officer Marshall's car barreled through the intersection without hesitation, striking Eleanor. His indifference afterward, standing with his hands on his hips, speaking casually into his radio, was a punch to the gut for everyone who saw it. Television anchors replayed the footage during evening news segments, and social media platforms were flooded with demands for action. Eleanor's story had become a rallying cry, and Michael knew the moment was ripe for change. At the community center, Michael sat at a round table with a small group of organizers. Flyers, markers, and stacks of petitions were scattered across the surface. "We need to keep the momentum going," Michael said, his voice firm. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about the entire system that allowed him to act like this without consequences." One of the organizers, a young teacher named Carmen, nodded. "The video got people talking, but we need to channel that energy into action." "What's our next move?" "A bigger rally," Michael replied. "One that brings together not just our neighborhood, but people from across the city. We'll march to City Hall and demand a full investigation into the department." Another organizer, Jamal, frowned. "You know they're going to push back. The police union is already spinning this as an anti-cop agenda." Michael leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "This isn't about being anti-cop. It's about accountability. If we let them twist the narrative, we lose. We have to stay focused on what really matters: justice for Eleanor and a safer future for everyone." The room fell quiet as the weight of his words sank in. Then Carmen broke the silence. I'll handle the permits for the march. Jamal, can you reach out to some local activists and see if they'll join us? Jamal nodded. On it. Good, Michael said. Let's get to work. As plans for the rally took shape, the neighborhood came alive with purpose. Residents hung banners from their windows. Justice for Eleanor. End negligence. Our lives matter. Businesses offered their support, donating water bottles, poster supplies, and even free meals for volunteers. People who had never been involved in activism before found themselves helping however they could, stuffing envelopes, knocking on doors, or simply sharing Eleanor's story online. Even children joined in. Maya, still shaken by what she had witnessed, worked with her friends to draw colorful signs for the march. One read, "Miss Eleanor helped us. Now we help her." Meanwhile, the police union doubled down on its defense of Officer Marshall. The officer involved followed proper protocol, their statement read. This was an unfortunate accident, and we urge the public not to rush to judgment. Michael slammed his laptop shut after reading the statement. His frustration boiled over. Proper protocol, he muttered. What kind of protocol lets you hit someone and then act like it's no big deal? Grace called him later that evening. They're trying to get ahead of us, she said. It's standard procedure. Minimize, deflect, and protect their own. Let them try, Michael replied. We're not backing down. The day of the rally arrived, and the streets were packed. Thousands of people gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans. The energy was electric, a powerful mix of anger, hope, and determination. Michael stood at the front, microphone in hand. The crowd quieted as he began to speak. Eleanor Wright is my aunt, he said, his voice carrying over the sea of faces. She's more than a victim of negligence. She's a mother, a mentor, and a pillar of this community. She represents what this neighborhood stands for: kindness, resilience, and strength. Cheers erupted, but Michael raised his hand for silence. This isn't just about her, he continued. It's about every single person who has been ignored, dismissed, or harmed by a system that refuses to change. Officer Marshall didn't act alone. He's a product of a culture that devalues people like my aunt, like all of us. He paused, letting his words sink in. But we have power. This rally, this movement, it shows that we won't stay silent. We demand justice for Eleanor, and we demand reform. No more excuses. No more lives treated like they don't matter. The crowd roared, the sound echoing off nearby buildings. As the march began, the sight was awe-inspiring. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the streets, their voices rising in unison. They marched past the precinct, where officers watched from behind closed doors, their faces unreadable. They marched past City Hall, where officials peered nervously through the windows. At the rally's end, Michael stood on the steps of City Hall, flanked by Grace and other community leaders. We're not asking for change, he declared. We're demanding it. The crowd erupted again, their chants growing louder. That evening, news stations across the city covered the march. Pundits debated its implications, some praising the community's courage, others questioning their demands. But for Michael and his neighbors, the march was a victory in itself. It showed the city and the world that their voices couldn't be ignored. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like change was possible. The rally had been a resounding success, but Michael knew it was only the beginning. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as he worked with Grace to prepare for the next phase, filing a lawsuit against Officer Marshall and the police department. The stakes were high. The police union was circling the wagons, defending Marshall with public statements that dismissed his actions as a momentary lapse. Behind the scenes, Michael could feel the resistance building. Smears, subtle threats, and whispers designed to discredit both him and Eleanor. One evening, Michael sat in Eleanor's dimly lit apartment, his laptop open on the coffee table. He stared at the screen, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of messages he'd received. Supporters sent stories of solidarity, while detractors called him an opportunist. The sound of Eleanor's favorite clock chiming softly in the corner brought him back to the present. He glanced at her empty chair, its cushion still slightly indented, and felt a pang of grief. He reached for his phone and dialed Grace. Grace, he said as soon as she answered. What's our timeline? We're on track, Grace replied, her voice steady. I've filed the paperwork for the lawsuit, and we've requested records from the department. But don't expect them to hand over anything willingly. Michael sighed. I figured as much. What about the video? It's crucial, Grace said, but it's only part of the case. We need to show that this wasn't just one bad moment. It was the result of a broken system. Michael nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Then we need more stories. More voices. Exactly, Grace said. And we need to make sure the media stays focused. If we lose their attention, the department will bury this. Over the next few weeks, Michael worked tirelessly to keep the momentum alive. He reached out to neighbors, activists, and anyone who had experienced harassment or neglect at the hands of the police. The stories he uncovered were heartbreaking and infuriating. A young mother, harassed for loitering while waiting for her child outside school. An elderly man, accused of theft because he fit the description. A teenager, handcuffed for jaywalking, even though he posed no threat. The pattern was clear. The people of his community weren't just ignored by the system, they were actively targeted by it. One day, Michael visited Mr. Bryant, the retired mechanic who had shared his story at the rally. Thanks for coming by, Mr. Bryant said, inviting Michael into his modest living room. I appreciate you speaking out, Michael replied, sitting down. It takes courage. Mr. Bryant shook his head. Courage? I've been scared my whole life, son. Scared of the police. Scared they'd take everything from me. What happened to your aunt? His voice faltered. It could have been me. It could have been anyone. Michael leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. We're going to make sure this stops, Mr. Bryant. I promise. Meanwhile, Grace's investigation into Officer Marshall's record uncovered damning evidence. He's been protected for years, she told Michael during a late-night call. At least 10 formal complaints. Most of them involved excessive force or racial profiling, and not one resulted in meaningful discipline. Michael's frustration boiled over. How is that even possible? Because the system protects its own, Grace said. They bury complaints, settle lawsuits quietly, and move on like nothing happened. It's a pattern we've seen over and over again. What do we do with this? Michael asked. We make it public, Grace replied. Let people see the truth for themselves. With Grace's help, Michael organized a press conference. They released Officer Marshall's record to the public, along with testimonials from neighbors who had faced harassment. The response was immediate and explosive. News outlets ran stories with headlines like, Officer's troubled past comes to light. Calls for police reform grow louder. Marshall's defenders scrambled to control the narrative, claiming the records were misleading and taken out of context. But Michael refused to back down. He gave interviews, appeared on panels, and used every platform available to tell the truth. This isn't just about my aunt, he said during one televised interview. It's about a system that allows people like Officer Marshall to stay in power. It's about the lives that have been destroyed because no one held them accountable. The tension reached a boiling point when Grace uncovered a critical piece of evidence, a memo from a senior officer recommending disciplinary action against Marshall years earlier. The memo had been ignored, and Marshall's misconduct had continued unchecked. This is it, Grace said, handing the document to Michael. This proves that they knew. They knew, and they did nothing. As the lawsuit moved forward, Michael faced growing personal challenges. The stress of the fight weighed heavily on him, and his relationships with friends and family began to strain. One evening, after another long day of organizing, Michael visited Eleanor at the hospital. She was still unconscious, her breathing steady but shallow. Sitting by her bedside, Michael spoke softly. Aunt Eleanor, he said, his voice breaking. I'm doing everything I can, but it's hard. So hard. He rested his head in his hands, letting the exhaustion and grief wash over him. Then, as if in response, Eleanor's hand twitched. Michael's head shot up, his heart pounding. He leaned forward, gripping her hand. Aunt Eleanor? Can you hear me? Her eyes fluttered open, just a crack. And Michael, she whispered, her voice barely audible. A surge of relief and emotion overwhelmed him. I'm here, Aunt Eleanor. I'm right here. She managed a faint smile. Good, don't give up. Promise me. Michael nodded, tears streaming down his face. I promise. Eleanor's brief moment of consciousness renewed Michael's determination. He left the hospital that night with a fire in his heart, ready to push even harder for the justice she deserved. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like he was truly winning. The next morning, Michael sat in Grace's office, a steaming cup of coffee untouched on the table beside him. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting lines across a whiteboard filled with notes, timelines, and pinned photos of witnesses. At the center was a picture of Eleanor, smiling warmly, a reminder of why they were fighting. We've got enough to make them squirm, Grace began, pacing as she reviewed their case. The video, Officer Marshall's disciplinary record, the ignored memo, it's damning. But we need to go further. The department is banking on their usual playbook: deny, deflect, and delay. We can't let them control the narrative. Michael leaned forward, his face set in determination. So what's the next move? Grace gestured toward the whiteboard. We go public again. The video started the conversation, but this, she tapped the ignored memo. This proves negligence at the highest levels. We need to show the world how deep this rot goes. Later that day, Michael organized another press conference, this time in front of City Hall. The air buzzed with tension as reporters gathered, cameras flashing. Behind Michael stood members of the community, neighbors, local activists, and even some of the people whose stories he'd collected over the weeks. Michael stepped up to the microphone, holding a copy of the memo in his hand. This is a memo written 3 years ago by a senior officer within the police department, he began, his voice strong and steady. It recommends disciplinary action against Officer Jacob Marshall for repeated misconduct, including harassment and reckless behavior. That action was never taken. He held the document up for the cameras to see. This memo was buried, Michael continued, and because of that, Officer Marshall continued to patrol our streets unchecked. My aunt, Eleanor Wright, was just one of many victims of a system that refuses to hold its own accountable. How many more lives need to be shattered before something changes? The crowd behind him erupted into applause and chants of justice for Eleanor as Michael stepped back. The revelation of the memo sent shockwaves through the city. News outlets covered the story relentlessly, and social media exploded with outrage. Negligence or cover-up? Police department under fire. Ignored complaints lead to tragedy, the Eleanor Wright case. The mayor, feeling the heat, announced an independent investigation into the department's practices. This is a step forward, Grace told Michael that evening, but we need to keep pushing. Public pressure is the only thing keeping this investigation honest. Meanwhile, the police union fought back harder than ever. Their representatives appeared on television, accusing Michael and Grace of vilifying Officer Marshall and tarnishing the reputation of the department. One segment on a local news channel showed a union spokesperson defending Marshall. Officer Marshall has served this city with dedication, the spokesperson claimed. The incident involving Ms. Wright was a tragic accident, not the result of negligence or malice. Watching the broadcast, Michael clenched his fists. Tragic accident, he muttered. They're still trying to sweep this under the rug. Despite the backlash, Michael's movement only grew stronger. Activists from across the city joined forces, holding rallies and organizing petitions demanding systemic reform. Local businesses displayed signs that read, "We stand with Eleanor." Accountability now. Even schools held assemblies where students wrote letters of support to Eleanor and her family. Then came a breakthrough. A young woman named Lisa Hernandez came forward with additional footage of the accident. She had been driving past the intersection when her dashboard camera recorded the entire event. The new footage, sharper and more detailed than the initial video, showed Officer Marshall speeding through the red light without hesitation. It also captured his complete disregard after the collision, as he exited the car, glanced at Eleanor, and turned back to his radio. "This footage changes everything," Grace said when Lisa handed over the video. "It's irrefutable evidence of negligence." Michael felt a surge of hope. They can't deny this. Not anymore. Grace and Michael released the footage to the media the following day. It went viral within hours, sparking an even larger wave of outrage. Community leaders, Civil rights organizations, and even national figures weighed in, demanding action. The police department, now cornered, announced that Officer Marshall had been placed on unpaid leave pending further investigation. For Michael, it wasn't enough. He should have been fired weeks ago, he told Grace. They're only doing this because their backs are against the wall. I know, Grace replied, but it's a step. And with this new footage, our case is stronger than ever. At the next rally, Michael stood before the crowd, his voice ringing with passion. This isn't just about one officer, he declared. It's about a culture that values power over people, that protects those who harm instead of those who serve. We're here to say enough is enough. This fight isn't just for Eleanor. It's for everyone who's been ignored, dismissed, or hurt by a broken system. The crowd roared in agreement, their chants echoing through the streets. Justice for Eleanor. Justice for all. Back at the hospital, Eleanor stirred in her bed. Though still weak, she was now awake more often, her eyes following Michael whenever he visited. You're doing so much, she said softly one afternoon, her voice raspy but steady. For me, for everyone. Michael took her hand, his heart heavy with emotion. I'm just doing what you've always done, Aunt Eleanor, looking out for people. Eleanor smiled faintly. You're going to change things, Michael. I can feel it. He nodded, determination in his eyes. I won't stop until we do. As the lawsuit moved closer to trial, the city was at a tipping point. The independent investigation uncovered years of misconduct within the department, exposing how officers like Marshall had been shielded from accountability. The findings were damning, and the calls for reform grew louder. Michael, exhausted but resolute, prepared for the battle ahead. The fight for Eleanor's justice had become a fight for the soul of the city, and he was ready to see it through. The courtroom was packed. The air buzzed with tension as the trial of Officer Jacob Marshall began. On one side of the room sat Michael, Grace, and their supporters, a sea of determined faces. On the other, Officer Marshall and his legal team, their expressions unreadable. The judge entered, and the bailiff called the court to order. All rise, he said, his voice echoing. Michael's heart pounded as he stood. This was the moment they had been fighting for, the moment when the truth would finally come to light. Grace rose to deliver the opening statement. Her voice was steady, her words precise. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about negligence, indifference, and a system that failed to protect its citizens, she began. Eleanor Wright, a beloved member of her community, was struck in a crosswalk by a police officer who ignored a red light and failed to slow down. This was not an accident. This was a preventable tragedy born from a culture of disregard and entitlement. She gestured to the jury, her gaze firm. We will prove that Officer Marshall's actions were not just careless but part of a pattern enabled by a department that ignored complaints, buried evidence, and allowed him to remain on the force despite repeated misconduct. Marshall's lawyer, a polished man named David Lynch, responded with a tone of calm authority. This case is a tragedy, but it is not a crime, he said. Officer Marshall was responding to a call, fulfilling his duty to protect and serve. What happened to Ms. Wright was unfortunate, but it was a momentary lapse in judgment, not negligence. Michael clenched his fists under the table, the words momentary lapse burning into his mind. The first witnesses were called, paramedics, traffic analysts, and residents who had been present at the scene. Each testified to the chaos of the day, painting a vivid picture of the collision. Then came Maya, the young girl who had been holding Eleanor's hand at the time of the accident. Maya sat in the witness chair, her small frame dwarfed by the surroundings. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edges of the seat. Grace approached her with a kind smile. Maya, Grace said gently, can you tell us what you remember from that day? Maya's voice was small but clear. We were crossing the street. The light was green for us, and Miss Eleanor was holding my hand. And then what happened? Maya swallowed hard. The car came fast. It didn't stop. Miss Eleanor tried to move, but her voice cracked, and she looked down at her hands. It hit her. Grace nodded, her voice soft. Thank you, Maya. You were very brave that day. Michael watched as Maya stepped down, her shoulders slumped. The weight of the moment was heavy on her small frame. Next, Grace called witnesses who had filed complaints against Officer Marshall in the past. One by one, they shared their stories. Mr. Bryant recounted how Marshall had searched his car without cause. A young woman described being detained for no reason while walking home. A shop owner detailed the verbal harassment she endured when she questioned Marshall's actions. Each testimony painted a damning picture of a man who had abused his authority repeatedly, with no consequences. David Lynch tried to discredit the witnesses, pointing out inconsistencies and framing their complaints as misunderstandings. "Isn't it possible," Lynch asked Mr. Bryant, "that Officer Marshall was simply doing his job?" Bryant's voice wavered but held firm. "If his job is to humiliate innocent people, then sure. But that's not the job we need police to do." Then came the most critical piece of evidence, the video footage. The courtroom fell silent as the recording played. It showed the red light, the speeding police car, and the moment of impact. Gasps rippled through the room as the footage zoomed in on Marshall exiting the car, glancing at Eleanor, and speaking casually into his radio without showing any sign of concern. Grace paused the video and addressed the jury. "This is the moment," she said, her voice steady. "The moment when Officer Marshall could have acted with humanity. Instead, he chose indifference." Finally, Michael took the stand. He had prepared for this moment, but as he sat in the witness chair and faced the jury, a wave of emotion threatened to overwhelm him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Michael," Grace began, "can you tell us about your aunt, Eleanor Wright?" Michael smiled faintly, his voice thick with emotion. She's everything to me. She raised me after my parents died. She taught me how to be strong, how to care about people, how to fight for what's right. And how has this incident affected her, and you?" Michael's throat tightened. "She's still in the hospital. She can't walk. She struggles to talk. The woman who taught me to be strong now has to fight just to survive." Tears welled in his eyes as he continued. "I'm here because she deserves justice. Because people like her, people who've spent their lives giving to others, shouldn't be treated like they don't matter." The defense called Officer Marshall to the stand. Marshall appeared calm and confident as he testified. "I was responding to a call," he said. "It was urgent. I didn't see Ms. Wright in time to stop." Grace cross-examined him relentlessly. "Officer Marshall," she asked, "how many complaints have been filed against you during your career?" Marshall hesitated. "I don't recall the exact number. Is it more than 10? "Yes," he admitted, his voice clipped. "More than 15? Marshall shifted uncomfortably. "Yes." "And how many of those complaints resulted in disciplinary action?" "None," he muttered. Grace turned to the jury. "This is the pattern. A man allowed to continue harming others because the system refused to hold him accountable." After days of testimony, the trial came to a close. The jury left to deliberate, and the courtroom fell into an anxious silence. Michael sat with Grace, his heart pounding. "Do you think we've done enough?" he asked. Grace placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We've shown them the truth. Now it's up to them to decide." Hours later, the jury returned. The foreman stood, holding a slip of paper. "In the matter of Eleanor Wright versus Officer Jacob Marshall," he said, his voice steady, "we find the defendant guilty of negligence." A wave of relief swept through the room. Michael closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. Justice, at last. Outside the courthouse, a massive crowd had gathered. When the verdict was announced, cheers erupted. People hugged, cried, and chanted, "Justice for Eleanor." Michael stepped out to address the crowd. "This isn't just a victory for my aunt," he said, his voice strong. "It's a victory for every person who has been ignored, dismissed, or dehumanized. This is the beginning of real change." The crowd roared, their voices rising like a wave of hope. Back at the hospital, Michael sat by Eleanor's bed. She was awake, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "They found him guilty," Michael said softly. Eleanor smiled, her hand resting on his. "You did good, Michael. You did what needed to be done." He nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace. "I couldn't have done it without you, Aunt Eleanor. You gave me the strength to fight." The courtroom victory against Officer Jacob Marshall marked a pivotal moment, not just for Eleanor Wright and her family, but for the entire community. Yet, As Michael stepped into the morning sunlight the day after the verdict, he knew the battle wasn't over. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but systemic change required a much longer fight. A time for healing. At the hospital, Eleanor was slowly regaining her strength. Her voice, though faint, had returned, and with the help of physical therapy, she had begun to sit up and even take small steps with assistance. Michael visited her every evening, bringing stories of the community's progress and the countless people rallying behind her. "You've become a symbol," he told her one evening, holding her hand. "People are standing up because of you." Eleanor smiled softly, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "I'm no symbol, Michael. I'm just an old woman trying to get through the day." "You're more than that," Michael said, his voice firm. "You showed us what kindness and resilience look like. Now, it's our turn to make sure your fight means something." The push for reform. Emboldened by the trial's outcome, Michael and Grace turned their attention to systemic reform. Their first goal was to present a detailed proposal to the city council, demanding sweeping changes in police accountability. The proposal called for a civilian oversight board with the authority to investigate misconduct, mandatory body cameras for all officers, improved training on implicit bias and de-escalation tactics, a transparent system for handling complaints, ensuring they could no longer be ignored or buried. Michael spent weeks organizing meetings, gathering signatures, and rallying support. The community was with him every step of the way, their determination ignited by Eleanor's story. "We're not just fixing the system for us," Michael said during one town hall meeting. "We're fixing it for future generations. For kids like Maya, who deserve to grow up in a city that protects them." Resistance and perseverance. As expected, the push for reform met resistance. Police union representatives and some city officials argued that the demands were unrealistic and accused Michael and Grace of demonizing law enforcement. Michael refused to back down. "This isn't about being anti-police," he said during an interview. "It's about being pro-accountability, pro-justice, pro-community. We're asking for a system that works for everyone, not just a select few." Public opinion was firmly on Michael's side. Social media was flooded with support, and local businesses continued to display banners reading "Justice for Eleanor" and "Accountability Now." Even national civil rights organizations joined the cause, amplifying the movement's reach and adding pressure on city officials to act. A day of reckoning. The day of the city council meeting arrived. The chambers were packed, with standing room only as Michael and Grace presented their case. Michael spoke with raw emotion, recounting the impact of Eleanor's accident and the years of neglect and harm his community had endured. "This isn't just about one officer or one case," he said. "This is about a system that has failed to protect the people it's supposed to serve. We're here today to demand change, not tomorrow, not someday. Today." Grace followed with a sharp, data-driven presentation, laying out the proposal's specifics and dismantling the arguments against reform. The council members listened intently, their faces a mix of concern and contemplation. Victory at last. Hours later, after a heated debate, the council voted. By a narrow margin, the proposal passed. The community erupted in applause and cheers, their voices echoing through the chamber. Michael stood among them, tears in his eyes. He turned to Grace, who gave him a triumphant smile. "You did it," she said. "No," Michael replied. "We did it." A new beginning. Over the following weeks, the reforms began to take shape. The Civilian Oversight Board was established, staffed by people from diverse backgrounds, including community leaders and legal experts. Body cameras were rolled out, and training programs were revamped. The neighborhood felt a shift, not an immediate transformation, but the first steps toward a brighter future. Eleanor's return. On a crisp autumn morning, Eleanor was discharged from the hospital. The entire neighborhood gathered to welcome her home, lining the streets with banners, balloons, and flowers. As Michael helped her out of the car, a wave of applause erupted. Children ran up to hug her, and neighbors showered her with words of love and gratitude. Eleanor, leaning on a cane but smiling brightly, looked around at the faces she had come to love over her decades in the neighborhood. "You've all done so much," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you." Michael stood beside her, his arm around her shoulder. "This is all because of you, Aunt Eleanor. You inspired us." The future ahead. Months later, as life in the neighborhood began to settle, Michael reflected on everything they had accomplished. Sitting with Eleanor on her porch, he watched children playing in the street, their laughter filling the air. "You think things will stay better?" Eleanor asked softly. Michael nodded. "They'll stay better because we won't stop fighting. We've come too far to go back." Eleanor smiled, her hand resting gently on his. "You're going to change the world, Michael. Just don't forget to take care of yourself, too." He laughed, a lightness in his heart that he hadn't felt in months. "I'll try, Aunt Eleanor. I promise." Epilogue. Strength in unity. The reforms inspired other communities across the city and beyond to demand change. Eleanor's story became a symbol of resilience, and Michael emerged as a powerful advocate for justice and accountability. Years later, the neighborhood thrived, its streets safer, its people united. Eleanor's legacy lived on, not just in the reforms but in the lives she had touched and the movement she had inspired. And in the hearts of those who loved her, one truth remained clear. Justice was possible, as long as people had the courage to fight for it together.